Hello and welcome to part 2 of a series that you can use to help you determine your personality type. In the last episode we explored the dominant function, the primary domain of the ego complex, that which we are most willing to take responsibility for, the area of cognition in which we are most comfortable making decisions. And if you haven't already seen the first episode of this series, I highly recommend you do so, because in this second episode we are veering all the way to the other end of the cognitive stack in order to examine the oppositional function. Misunderstood by many systems to be inferior, this function is actually very powerful. However, as the natural antagonist to the dominant function, it is divergent in nature. Therefore, it is a function we are much more observant of than we are willing to take active responsibility for. But this lack of conscious responsibility does not make it inferior. In fact, for example, in the case of thinking, it is a lack of conscious responsibility that allows a person to adhere more to frameworks and scientific literature than they do rely upon their own convergent conclusions. And therefore, while there is a tendency in, say, about 20% of people for this function to be suppressed, in most cases it performs a very unique and vital role within the cognitive stack. So with that all out of the way, let us start exploring the 16 variations of the oppositional function. And it is my hope by the end of this video you can use episode 2 alongside episode 1 in order to effectively determine your primary axis. Because even if you are unsure of your dominant function, you can effectively use your oppositional function to determine what your dominant function is, because these two functions exist on either side of the same coin. So do you feel most uncomfortable engaging the internal abstract? Using your own imagination, for example, to determine a relationship between various abstract concepts, foreseeing future outcomes, taking responsibility for the person you want to become? Do you feel like you're constantly anchoring into the here and now, pursuing intense novel experiences in order to essentially escape or abdicate responsibility for the future version of who you are? Well, in this case, you might have an introverted intuitive oppositional function, the opposing function of extraverted sensing. In this case, your axis would be extraverted sensing as a dominant function and introverted intuition as your oppositional function. Because while it doesn't mean you cannot do all of these things, while it does not mean you cannot think abstractly, you will tend to feel uncomfortable doing so for prolonged amounts of time. And there will be a constant temptation within your mind relative to the fluidity of your dominant axis to live very intensely within the moment, to spontaneously affect your external world, essentially shutting off a convergent dialogue within an introverted intuitive spectrum. And is this internal abstract dialogue more limbic in nature? Do you feel a raw sense of individuality? Do you want to live as concretely, as presently as you can within the moment in order to be the most complete version of who you are? Do you live in this kind of paradox whereby you feel like you are meant for great things, all the while highly uncertain of how exactly this greatness is going to manifest in the future? Well, then you may be an ESFP, known as the ESTFN within CPT, because the ESFP has introverted feeling connected to their introverted intuitive oppositional function. Or do you perhaps have much more certainty with regards to the underlying fabric of reality? Do you live in a paradox whereby you are generally unwilling to engage philosophical thought or explore the different possibilities presented by an internal abstract perspective, all the while believing yourself to see things for how they are, even in some circumstances viewing philosophical discourse as pointless, because it is already readily apparent what the truth is behind what you see? Do you have a strong sense of abstract holistic logic that you do not feel consciously responsibility for, all the while being able to trust in your big picture orientation to provide the answers that are necessary for the circumstances? Well, you may be an ESTP, known as the ESFTN within CPT, because the ESTP has introverted thinking connected to their introverted intuitive oppositional function. Or would you say that an abstract dialogue that you are, say, much more observant of than you are willing to take conscious active responsibility for is much more external in nature? Would you say that you are very observant of a holistic external atmosphere, but very much unwilling to play upon it, unwilling to experiment with the different perspectives and abstractions that could be formed upon this external realm? And perhaps also you have an internal dominant dialogue which is very tangible and concrete in nature, reflecting oftentimes upon that previously experienced and looking forward to new, meaningful, concrete experiences to reflect upon, oftentimes in an escape from a more abstract and uncertain external world. While you may very well have an oppositional function of extraverted intuition, being as you are an introverted sensing dominant. And perhaps this external holistic perception of the external world is much more limbic in nature. Perhaps you are highly aware of the holistic external social atmosphere, various different social nuances. And perhaps you seek to uphold social protocol and tradition in order to maintain a level of peace and harmony, all the while being unwilling to play upon the social atmosphere, all the while being unwilling to act in any way which you may consider to be socially chaotic. Well, you may very well be an ISFJ, because the ISFJ is extroverted feeling connected to their extroverted intuitive oppositional function. Or perhaps this holistic external lens of yours is much more cerebral in nature. Perhaps you are hyper-aware of the myriad of different moving parts in the external objective atmosphere. Perhaps you can fluidly understand and grasp how all of the various different mechanical components, external criteria, influence and interact with one another in order to inform an objective outcome. And all the while, perhaps you are extremely unwilling to play upon this extroverted intuitive atmosphere, to insert a level of chaos into the order of the external objective world. Well, perhaps you are an ISTJ, because an ISTJ has extroverted thinking connected to their extroverted intuitive oppositional function. And therefore, this is a type who is oftentimes very aware of the necessity of any kind of objective criteria. They oftentimes relate strongly to the necessity of hierarchy, to the necessity of pre-established institutions, all the while having a convergent introverted sensing dialogue, are generally unwilling to insert any kind of chaos into the equation, and therefore oftentimes use their introverted sensing, introverted feeling dialogue in order to relate to those things they oftentimes consider to be necessary in order to maintain a level of external holistic efficiency. Or perhaps you take creative exploration of and interaction with the abstract external world in your stride. In some instances, perhaps feeling like you are chasing the novel, chasing the new, chasing the unexplored, in retreat from the past, in retreat from tradition, and instead perhaps feel like you are perpetually running away from and taking responsibility for a more concrete internal dialogue. And perhaps for all that you are willing to explore and question the nature of the external world, perhaps you are highly unwilling to question the nature of your concrete self. Perhaps your internal concrete dialogue is an area in which you are very much unwilling to take responsibility for, an area of your psyche you are very much unwilling to change. And perhaps this unchanging, unyielding, static part of you is more limbic in nature. Perhaps your opinions and your sense of individuality has a unique worth. Perhaps you feel that individuality should be innately respected. Perhaps you have a constant and intense drive to be as authentic as you possibly can be, to never shy away from other people, always present people with the fullest extent of who you believe yourself to be. Well, you might have an introverted sensing oppositional function, being as you are an extroverted intuitive dominant. Perhaps concealing certain opinions, perhaps on occasion swallowing your pride, is something which is very uncomfortable for you to do. Well, in this case, you might be an ENFP, because an ENFP has introverted feeling connected to their introverted sensing oppositional function. And as such, while you are exploring the external atmosphere, you generally have a difficult time bringing yourself to account, making changes upon your identity, perhaps even on occasion backing up your opinions with cold and hard logic, and understanding that introverted feeling must be backed up with introverted thinking in order to present to people a valid opinion, and perhaps even stepping back from the intensity with which you usually pursue events, saying no to exciting new opportunities, and taking time out for yourself is an area that you feel you need to work on. Or perhaps this introverted sensing internal dialogue is much more objective in nature. Perhaps you are very cemented in what you view to be logical. Perhaps you have a very set and frameworked way of engaging reality. Perhaps you socialize in a very frameworked fashion. Perhaps you engage whatever particular pursuit you are passionate about, using a very set and rigid framework, within which there are a multitude of different building blocks that you could shove together and mix around, while very much feeling that as adept as you might be at moving all of these various different components and blocks around, you feel perhaps very restricted and even unwilling to engage frameworking and theorizing on a more atomic scale, and perhaps fear on some level that you are not as innately creative and outside of the box as other people might think. Well, in this case, you might be an ENTP, because this type has introverted thinking connected to their introverted sensing oppositional function. Therefore, as much as they pursue external creativities, often within the external holistic subjective atmosphere, they feel unwilling to take responsibility for the frameworks they've constructed in order to aid in their social endeavours. All the while being oftentimes highly aware and observant of these frameworks in the first place. And thus, in this instance, the lack of responsibility for these frameworks allows the person to adhere to them in a very reliable fashion. Or instead, perhaps this hyperdivergent lens is directed rather externally. Do you feel very intensely observant of a very specific portion of external reality? Can you lock onto a specific task you're engaged with? Do you consider yourself very sensitive to the information from the concrete external world? All the while, do you feel like you have a kind of tunnel vision in which you can only fixate upon a few things at once? And do you feel a kind of stress when you feel like your vision, your area of focus, is being pulled away in order to take in a larger portion of the external world? And do you perhaps feel like there's a constant pull and tug between an abstract internal dialogue and a concrete world which so often demands your attention? And perhaps you even feel on occasion like you're constantly running away from external reality, and oftentimes very conservative with what concrete experiences you are actually willing to engage, and perhaps even fearful of the new concrete experience, all the while deeply attached to the very specific things you decide are meaningful to you, to the very specific portion of the external world you are willing to affect. And perhaps the external reality you do choose to experience is very intense, very rich, and sometimes you may even feel like you are being overstimulated by it. Well, you may have an extraverted sensing oppositional function, because as observant and sensitive you are to the external world, you are generally much more willing to take responsibility for your future visions and your theories and various internal abstractions than the physical world around you. And the energy you do spend within that external world is often done so in a very conservative fashion. And perhaps this external sensitivity is much more limbic in nature. Perhaps you can lock onto the various micro-expressions of any given person. Perhaps you are highly sensitive to any kind of social stimuli, be it harmonious or otherwise. All the while, perhaps you are very hesitant to take active responsibility for the emotions you are observing. And generally, you may very well prefer to just react to social stimuli than risking the insertion of any kind of social chaos into the external atmosphere. Or perhaps this external sensitivity to the concrete world is much more objective in nature. Perhaps you are highly attuned to the atomic scale of what you are perceiving. Perhaps you feel like you observe reality with a kind of microscope, can lock on to any kind of objective task, and find what you are perceiving to be so meaningful that you want to complete the task at hand to the fullest extent possible. All the while, perhaps you prefer it if everyone just left you alone to focus on that which you find meaningful. And perhaps you can even spend hours at a time engaged with that particular activity in a constant fluid relation to the very intensely perceived, concrete, tangible component. Well, you may be an INTJ, known as the INFTS within CPT, and perhaps this assignment of value relates more to internally stored components. Perhaps you are highly certain of a set way of doing things. Perhaps you oftentimes operate to a framework, and generally obtain any understanding of reality, obtain any information that is relevant and meaningful to you from outside trusted sources. And perhaps oftentimes you even misidentify as someone who is unable to think. Because perhaps as easily as you find it to understand anything that is presented to you and assimilate it into your internal frameworks, you feel somewhat insecure in your ability to come up with your own original theory. Insecure perhaps in your ability to assess the frameworks you find meaningful, and perhaps even on occasion be overly zealous and religious in your application and adherence to the frameworks which are already established within your mind. Well, in this case, you might have an introverted thinking oppositional function, because the hyperdivergent introverted thinking is often a storehouse of knowledge and is often extremely adept at adhering to proven methods of doing things, all the while feeling somewhat uncertain in one's own ability to dismantle and reassimilate all of the knowledge contained within the brain in order to form your own original insight, and even perhaps struggle to adapt to and reconcile yourself with other applicable methodology, alternative perspectives and methods of understanding. And perhaps these introverted thinking frameworks are very concrete and tangible, very specific in nature. Perhaps you are in some respects very traditional. Perhaps you feel very little need to question pre-established methods of understanding reality. Perhaps you are perceived as others as extremely reliable because you tend to adhere to the letter of any given framework, whether it's completing a task, whether it's applying a very hard scientific approach to the exploration of new and engaging substrate. All the while, perhaps you feel insecure in your unwillingness or even inability to insert a level of chaos into the introverted thinking equation. Entertain different perspectives, dismantle tradition, question whether or not the pre-established method of doing something is the most optimal one. Well, you may very well be an ASFJ, because this type has introverted sensing connected to their introverted thinking oppositional function. Or perhaps rather than consult tradition and pre-established methodology, you rather turn more towards the holistic. Perhaps you rather seek a big picture holistic perspective, perhaps rather than having multiple different methodologies to apply to specific situations. You instead rely more upon a universal understanding of reality, a single framework you can apply to everything. And perhaps you lock on very intensely to specific future outcomes and pursue the expertise necessary, refine over time your universal frameworks in order to see that future outcome realized. An outcome oftentimes so connected to a maximization of one's own social utility. Well, you may very well be an ENFJ, known as the EFS-NT within CPT, because the ENFJ has introverted intuition connected to their introverted thinking oppositional function. And it is worth mentioning that in the case of a suppressed introverted thinking, there are some extraverted feeling dominants that run away from any kind of logic at all, and generally just abide by the expectations of those around them. Or perhaps this hyper-observance of objective information is rather directed externally. And perhaps for as hyper-aware as you are of the external objective landscape, as insightful as you might be as to what is actually occurring, what are the relationships between these perceived objective components, you feel a deep sense of insecurity as to positively navigate such external thinking frameworks as to realize any desired outcome in reality. You feel a kind of paradox in which, for as certain as you are in your own feelings and values, and as able as you are to envisage outcomes which are meaningful to you, you struggle to find the courage and energy necessary and the certainty required to make a decision to see a task through to the end. You might find yourself even gravitating naturally towards a hard science. And again, feel a kind of paradox whereby you are very able to follow instructions to the letter. You are very happy and comfortable and adept at following a framework, yet struggle to form such plans and frameworks yourself, perform tasks for other people or other institutions to a high degree of perfectionism, and yet struggle to even start a task that would be done at one's own behest, for the sake of the self. Well, in this case, you might have an extraverted thinking oppositional function, because it's hyper-divergent and thus hyper-observational and aware you may very well be of the interaction between different objective components that you are perceiving. You may oftentimes struggle to make decisions and generally hold yourself to such a high standard of perfectionism whereby no outcome may seem more desirable than a bad outcome. And there's a tendency for this oppositional function to produce a kind of unconscious, oftentimes, fear of reality itself collapsing around you. And perhaps the perception of all this objective information is extremely broad. Perhaps you can easily assimilate and take in the vast overview of external reality, and yet perhaps even struggle to hone in to a specific task, and generally find yourself, when engaged perhaps in a creative pursuit, to operate on a more component basis, and perhaps even struggle perceiving the external world in a more atomic scale. Well, you may very well be an INFP, known as the IFS-NT within CPT, because this type has extraverted intuition connected to their extraverted thinking oppositional function. Or perhaps your gaze towards external objective data is much more specific. Perhaps you have a fine eye for detail. Perhaps you can really lock yourself into a task and lose yourself in the present moment, the present concrete experience. And perhaps your perfectionism here is directed less towards the big picture than it is towards the minute detail. And perhaps you are even naturally virtuosic in your ability to perceive and contend with the microscopic, fine-tune any given performance or work of art or project, and make sure that no stone is left unturned. Well, you may very well be an ISFP, known as the IFN-ST within CPT, because this type has extraverted sensing connected to their extraverted thinking, and therefore their perception of this objective external landscape is much more narrow and specific in scope, rather than trying to encapsulate a vast array of moving parts The ISFP is instead very selective with what they choose to engage with. Or perhaps rather you take decision-making and strategies in your stride, and rather struggle with a convergent dialogue with the core of who you are. Perhaps you see your needs and your desires as a relentless driving force that is not to be questioned, having a certain rigidity of character, having a certain intensity, all the while struggling to adapt to yourself, to transform yourself, and perhaps even on occasion in the case of a suppressed oppositional function, having absolutely no idea what's going on within your own emotional state, having no idea what is valuable to you, what is meaningful to you, engaging with the objective external atmosphere entirely for its own sake. Well, in these instances, you may very well have introverted feeling as your oppositional function, being as you are an extroverted thinking dominant. Perhaps you attach yourself very strongly to desired future outcomes. Perhaps you have a very strong sense of character. Perhaps you are, in some ways, the embodiment of an archetype. And perhaps you pride yourself on a certain tenacity, the ability to lock on to a specific desired future outcome and do whatever it takes to ensure that this desire of yours is fulfilled. Perhaps you fear a certain lack of control over your own emotional state, and fear not only a lack of ability to relate to the world around you, but also an inability to adapt to any circumstances in which things do not go your way. Well, you may very well be an ENTJ, known as the ETS NF within CPT, because this type has introverted intuition connected to their introverted feeling oppositional function, and therefore their emotional world is very plethoric and intense, modelling itself oftentimes upon archetypes, while oftentimes owing to this kaleidoscopic inner world, feeling somewhat emotionally lost at sea. Or perhaps your sense of individuality is much more intense. Perhaps you concretely know exactly what is meaningful to you. You feel very set in your values, and do not foresee future outcomes as much as you consecrate previous experiences and methodologies that you have found to be personally meaningful to you. And perhaps you fear an inability to reform your character, to question your values, to detach yourself emotionally from that which has previously worked for you, to adapt to the ever-changing world around you, lest you become a relic of the past, and perhaps you may even fear becoming obsolete, as the world is constantly changing around you, and the character which has perhaps allowed you to fit into various niches in the past is no longer valued within modern society. Well, in this instance, you may very well be an ESTJ, known as the ETN SF within CPT, because this type has introverted sensing connected to their introverted feeling, and therefore they model themselves and their personality and what they desire more upon the tangible than the abstract. Or perhaps this lack of responsibility towards a feeling substrate is more directed externally. Perhaps you are comparably more willing to take responsibility for and alter and shape and adapt your own character, but generally less willing to directly affect the emotional world around you. And perhaps you must generally feel very comfortable around a person before you have the confidence necessary to start positively affecting the social atmosphere, to start sharing your own thoughts and feelings with the other person. And perhaps in this sense you are extremely private, because as curious as you might be about people, and as adept as you might very well be at making new connections, you may feel very conservative in the formation of deeper attachments. And perhaps absent this deep connection with any given person, you instead adhere to a general kind of social conduct, a framework of social acceptability. And perhaps as you yourself adhere so strongly to these frameworks of what is socially acceptable, you may even find yourself being extremely judgmental of another person if they do not exhibit the same conduct. And perhaps as often as you may very well be attentive to the social world around you, to the mannerisms and expressions and attire of other people, this may produce a kind of paradox in which you are hyper aware of the social world around you and yet extremely disconnected to it, conservative in the energies you put into the social atmosphere, and maybe even insecure for all your perhaps natural networking potential to perform any kind of leadership role within a social atmosphere. Well, you may very well have an oppositional function of extraverted feeling. And perhaps this hyper-observant extraverted feeling is directed across a holistic external atmosphere. Perhaps you cannot help but notice the fluctuations in any given crowd setting. Perhaps you perceive the social world around you as a kind of waves, a kind of atmosphere, and you pride yourself not only in your ability to read those waves and fluctuations, but also predict them, predict the social outcome a single instance will lead to. And you may even find this when watching films, for example. And as such, you may have a very strong sense of social consequence, generally feel unwilling to perform a certain chaotic role within any given situation you are not comfortable with, because this will inhibit your ability to predict the social outcome. And to compensate for this, you may very well rely upon a holistic social framework. And absent the company of someone you might feel you can deeply trust and let your guard down around, generally comply with a loose social framework in order to ensure that you yourself do not breach social protocol, lest the awkwardness ensue. At the same time, perhaps in the company of those you trust, you completely drop the social protocol and then suddenly become very prone to offending other people because you are no longer engaging this function that is necessary in order to predict the emotional response of another. Well, you may very well be an INTP, known as the ITS NF within CPT, because the INTP's oppositional function of extraverted feeling is connected to an extraverted intuitive lens. Or perhaps your attunement to the social world around you is much more intense and focused. Perhaps you can largely ignore the crowd, perhaps you can largely ignore the group and the holistic social infrastructure and focus instead on a very specific social interaction. And perhaps this lends you a certain intensity of character. And perhaps rather than predicting a social outcome, you either instead aim to surround yourself with people with whom you can be entirely spontaneous, or abstain from any kind of social interaction with those who you do not completely trust. Because it is only around those who you trust who you're willing to engage extraverted feeling in a spontaneous and reactive manner. Well, you may very well be an ISTP, known as the ITN SF within CPT, because the ISTP has an extraverted sensing lens connected to their extraverted feeling oppositional function. And therefore they are much more specific and reactive than they are holistic and predictive. So it is now my hope that you can use this function alongside the first episode in this series in order to determine your dominant axis. Because the oppositional functions I've presented in this video, as the name implies, are the opposite of the dominant function. And therefore all you need to do is determine a single one of these functions. If you've determined your dominant function, you can assume your oppositional. And if you have now determined your oppositional function and you are uncertain about your dominant, you can use the antagonistic relationship between both of these functions in order to now assume your dominant function. And while I have very much brushed over the auxiliary functions within both episode 1 and episode 2 of this series, episode 3 will be presenting them in much more depth. And it is once you understand both your dominant, your convergent auxiliary, your divergent auxiliary, and your oppositional function, that there is no other type that you can be. That is when you acquire certainty in your type. Much more certainty than any online test or instrument can ever give you. So thank you so much for watching that. I hope it was useful, and definitely share it with anyone who you think might benefit from it. And just a reminder, I do offer a type service for anyone who's uncertain about the type or just wants some additional clarification as to what the type means for them. And I also have a CPT ebook for those who want to read further into the functions. And I also offer a type development service for anyone who wants to use a cognitive function model in order to improve themselves and their own life. And just one final call to action, and if you are still with me so far, thank you, you are awesome. CPT is now on Patreon, so if you have both the will and the way to support the channel on that additional level, that would be massively appreciated. But know that I am already massively grateful for your support over here. And if you haven't already done so, make sure to click that subscribe button down below with the bell icon next to it, that way you can stay notified of future content. So once again, I hope the video was useful. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.